Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. A major conflict between Russia and Turkey was seemingly averted last week when their respective presidents, Vladimir Putin and Recep Tayyip Erdogan, met in Moscow and reached a relatively limited arrangement for an immediate ceasefire in Syria's northwestern Idlib governorate. Nevertheless, to judge by past agreements which were proclaimed but never fully implemented, the Syrian situation is as fragile as ever. To analyze the latest developments pertaining to this topic, we're joined here in the studio by Ms. Paula Slier, who is the Middle East Bureau Chief at Russia Today. Welcome. I'd like also to welcome our TV7 analyst, Mr. Amir Oren, and Dr. Eytan Cohen Yanarocak, who is a research fellow at the Moshe Dayan Center at Tel Aviv University and the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Oren, give us a broader recap on the latest developments pertaining to this topic.
So it's typical for the 9-year-old Syrian conflict that when we are talking about the latest chapter, Syria is hardly mentioned. It's two other protagonists, Turkey and Russia, who were fighting already, even though they didn't want to emphasize this fact. There were casualties, especially on the Turkish side. And just before it came to loggerheads, the leaders, the presidents met and decided on a ceasefire, on joint patrols somewhere, on a security zone, on the margins of the most important highways, crossing this area from northwest to southeast and from the south to the north, from Damascus to Aleppo, and towards the Mediterranean where the Russians are based. And as they finished having this arrangement, President Erdogan suddenly recalled that Turkey is also a member of NATO. Mm-hmm. And NATO is, of course, led by the United States, which is Russia's chief rival. So Erdogan flew to Brussels to ask for the alliance's consideration and concern, and just to add fuel to the fire, even though the price of fuel went down recently, Greece, another member of the alliance, closed its border so that Turkey cannot push those migrants who have resided in it towards the western part of Europe as a sort of leverage on the European members of NATO to come to its assistance in what is happening in Syria.
Ms. Lear, up until a couple of months ago, we had the warmest relations in the history between Turkey and Russia. President Vladimir Putin, of course, also traveled to Istanbul, where he met with the Turkish leader, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, and they discussed various challenges in Libya, and also, of course, the opening of a gas pipeline and various endeavors that really further bolstered the bilateral relations between the two countries. Very quickly, everything deteriorated when it came to Syria, as even though the gas and oil lobbies in Moscow are very active and encourage the Kremlin to persist in their relations with Ankara, at the same time, the lobbies of defense and security highlight the importance of the strategic interests in Syria, Latakia, Tartus, Hamimim air base, of course, and everything that pertains to that, which has reemerged the Russian Federation as somewhat of an international player when it comes to regional affairs here in the Middle East. To what degree, you've been lately in Moscow, to what degree is this respite that occurred between Ankara and Moscow, if you will, I will call it that way, really deep-rooted in historical rivalries, or is it actually just something that occurred because of the conflicting interests of Russia?
I've heard it said, and I think it's a nice way of understanding the Russian-Turkey relationship, that it's a marriage almost of convenience, if you like, and that the two partners stay together because of the kids. And you talk about oil and gas concerns, you talk about trade. For example, the Russians are helping to build the first nuclear plant in Turkey. All of that is your kids, if you like. So they have benefits, but the sides don't really trust each other. They don't necessarily see long-term goals in the same way. And so they'll come together on matters where they need to come together. So, for example, when Russia delivered the S-400, that's a tick for Russia-Turkish relations. On the other hand, Russia doesn't want to push Turkey completely into the ambit of NATO, which you referenced earlier. So there'll be this bit of give and take. And the flare-up we see at the moment has the real potential to be more than just a flare-up. I mean, that is the big concern, is that you could see a showdown between Russia and Turkey per se. I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think most people think that's going to happen. And it's in no one's interest that that actually happens. And that's why we've had this ceasefire meeting that happened now. And I think it's important to note that the meeting happened in Moscow. Erdogan would much rather the meeting had happened in Turkey. The fact that it happened in Moscow, and if you look at the body language and the photo op that was given, a lot of people say that it was really Putin calling the shots, and that if you ask me directly who's got the stronger upper hand here, it certainly would be the Russians.
It indeed seems that way, and many people are speaking about that. Dr. Cohen Yanarocak, to what degree is Turkey in the place that it wants to be, considering the latest developments pertaining to this issue? And we've seen really an attempt of Turkey to show its confidence or apparent confidence pertaining to its demand to be a major player in global politics, the demand of being regarded as not only regional power, but part of the world powers in order to really exercise its own foreign policy for not only regional elements, but also global elements. And again, we heard James Jeffrey, speaking about the fact that the United States, the U.S. Congress, and the White House are still very much concerned about the S-400 surface-to-air missile systems being integrated in the Turkish aerial defense array, something that the Turks are still refusing to even consider relinquishing in favor of its NATO allies, which it so much wanted to call upon. Of course, it called for the fourth charter, which demands for consultations, but it also was considering the option of calling for the fifth article within the NATO charter, which would mean additional forces from NATO allied members coming into Turkey. The only one doing it at this moment is Spain, and intelligence sharing between the United States and Turkey.
Given the high casualties that the Turkish armed forces suffered, from my perspective, Turkey did not get what it really wanted. But they could demonstrate their power in terms of their abilities with the unmanned air vehicles. The Turkish air forces tested the ability of the Russian anti-ballistic missile systems by sending their UAVs, because the Russians closed the Syrian air territory to the Turkish F-16s. And in the meanwhile, Mr. Erdogan received many positive feedbacks at home, but on the other hand, he received very harsh criticisms because of this high casualties. And we also understood something, that these extraterritorial military operations of the Turkish armed forces in Syria, well, this time it was not the same like the previous one, because in the previous operations we witnessed that the Turkish armed forces did not suffer casualties, but rather the Free Syrian Army, because all of these operations were targeting the PYD-YPG, the Kurdish organization. So in this, the last operation, we have witnessed that fighting against an organized army of a state is not the same like fighting with a guerrilla organization. And because of this high casualties, also Mr. Erdogan received very harsh criticism at home. So given the fact that Mr. Erdogan could not push the Syrian regime of Bashar al-Assad to the southern part of the Turkish observation outposts, we can say that, in a very simplistic manner, that Turkey did not achieve what it really wanted. But again, given the fact that Turkey could stop this offensive against the Idlib city center, so we can say that, partially they achieved their goal, but I think it's very temporary. We also witnessed in the past that the two of the sides, they declared these kind of ceasefires, but later we have witnessed that this conflict was renewed. And in order to strengthen his position, Mr. Erdogan is also using the European card by opening its borders to Greece. Now, Mr. Erdogan is trying to trigger a new refugee influx into the Europe. I would like to mention, and even I would like to correct myself, instead of using refugees, I would like to use the term migrants, because according to the Turkish press, most of the people who are going to the borders are from Afghanistan, are from Pakistan, are from West Bank, Palestinians, and of course some of them are from Syria, but the vast majority of these migrants are coming from other countries. So meaning that they are not running away from a conflict in Istanbul, in Turkey, in Ankara. There is no war. It is not a war zone. So from my perspective, I'm just thinking twice before calling these people refugees. I mean, of course, they're refugees, but not like refugees that are running away from a war theater.
The majority of which TV7 can confirm, indeed, from our sources on the ground, people who have been on the borders and elsewhere in Turkey and in Greece, the majority of which did indeed come from Afghanistan and elsewhere, not necessarily Syrian refugees who are quite interested in returning to Syria after this whole situation is done with. But Mr. Oren, Operation Spring Shield, as the Turks called it, the main objective, as also Hulusi Akar, the defense minister of Turkey, as well as President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, quite clearly stated, aims to create a buffer zone in order to protect the Syrian refugees in those areas, forcing them to remain in Syrian territory rather than spill into Turkey, considering the fact that Turkey is already hosting an estimated number of 3.6 to 3.7 million refugees. It is quite understandable that they would want to do so. And even though I do agree with the point of Paula talking about the fact that President Putin is the one who's calling the shots about Syria, the fact of the matter is he did come, or President Erdogan came to an arrangement with his Russian counterpart about establishing this barrier. As you correctly mentioned, the strategic highway M4, where they agreed to establish a corridor of 6 kilometers for each direction, which is a little bit over 2.7 miles. There is a lot of Turkish demands that came about. Why still is Turkey not able to assert wholeheartedly its interests in its southern neighbor, considering its power when it comes to its military might?
So one shouldn't confuse cause and effect here. The cause of what has happened between Idlib and the Turkish border is that there is a lot of fighting between the Syrians backed by the Russians and what they, the Syrians and the Russians, call terrorists. You would call them jihadists, and the Turks would call them anti-regime forces. And the Turks were backing those forces who are fighting Assad.
Speaking specifically about Tahrir al-Sham, whose leader is al-Julani, Muhammad al-Julani, who was the commander of Jabhat al-Nusra, an al-Qaeda-linked group. He's considered to be the number 2 after al-Zawahiri and al-Qaeda, which is an internationally recognized terror organization.
That's true, and the name al-Julani, of course, refers to the Golan Heights,
Indeed.
which he wants to liberate after he's finished with his other enemies. So for Israel, of course, he too is an enemy. But if we are focusing on the northwestern part of Syria, for the Turks, it doesn't really matter how you characterize those forces. They are against them. For the Russians, these forces are right now a problem for Assad. So they have to take care of them. But one should even look at it strategically. Why in the first place meaning as early as the 1950s, why are the Russians so interested in Syria? Because the Turks control the straits. If the Russians wanted to send their squadron out of the Black Sea, they had to move through Turkish-held territories or territorial waters, and of course, under international conventions, the Turks have to let them move through.
Namely Bosphorus?
Yes, but if the Turks decide to close the straits against the international conventions, as the Egyptians did.
It's a declaration of war.
Yes, of course, but it is possible. And that's why the Russians didn't want to be at the mercy of anyone else, and they leapfrogged over Turkey to Syria for Latakia and Tartus in order to have naval bases in the Mediterranean without asking for favors or having to play favorites with the Turks. And this has happened for the last 60 years already. What is happening now is that the Russians want a friendly regime to stay in Damascus, which is why they are propping up Bashar al-Assad. And if the Turks are against Assad, the Russians are against the Turks.
Ms. Lear, when we're talking about the Bosphorus Strait, which is very strategic, of course, if the Turks do close it, which crosses alongside Istanbul city, this will be a declaration of war, and war would ensue afterwards between Russia and Turkey, something that will draw also NATO into the picture. But, of course, considering the fragile relationship between NATO and Turkey right now, there are a lot of question marks pertaining to this. I want to ask you specifically, prior to the negotiations between President Erdogan and President Putin, we saw the fact that Turkey was stepping up its efforts to raise the tolls of damage and casualties in the Syrian army in order to somehow convince Putin that it's not in his favor to keep this escalation from going. But at the same time, the Russians also negotiated on the field, sending significant amounts of weaponry, which includes also 2 frigates with sophisticated surface-to-air and surface-to-surface missiles, ballistic missiles for that matter, something that was also signaling Turkey that they're not going to just stand aside and let the Turks do whatever they want. But even though they announced about 2 frigates going through the Bosphorus, there were about 3 to 4, at least 3 to 4 other frigates that entered that strait, showing additional force to Turkey, and there was a lot of negotiation on the ground, which led to this limited arrangement between Moscow and Ankara. To what degree is Russia resolved when it comes to the situation in Syria?
I think part of your question is also the question about how much of Idlib or how much of Syria is Russia prepared to have the Syrian army retake? Are we talking about the whole of Idlib, or are we talking about a buffer zone there? Russia's been involved in Syria already for the period of 5 years. This is really the last stronghold of the rebel groups. It's the final stand, if you like. Russia cannot have it seen that the Syrian army and the Syrian regime doesn't actually win the Syrian war in the final run, because they've invested so much all along, and its reputation stands on it. Following on from what Amir said, Syria is not just about Syria. It's a stronghold from Syria to the rest of the region. It's a message to the international community, if you like, that Russia is a superpower. So the fundamental question is, how much more does Assad want to have? Does he want the whole of Idlib? And assuming that he does, well, then Russia needs to back him to the ultimate, because it needs to actually save face in terms of what it's doing there.
At what expense?
Well, I want to go back to something you said as well. We talk about who is in Idlib. We have about 3.5 to 4.5 million people, but amongst them are the groups that you've referenced in terms of groups that have connections to Al-Qaeda. Now, it's estimated that that's about 1% of the population. So we're talking about 20,000 people. It doesn't seem a lot, but for the Russians, amongst those 20,000 fighters are several hundred who come from Russia and who come from former Soviet Union states. And right from the start, Russia made it quite clear that one of its motivations for getting involved in Syria, aside from everything else, was also to push back the threat of terror. Russia, I don't think, is prepared to rest on its laurels until it's convinced that these people have been neutralized, whatever you want to take that term to mean, and that there's no threat of them actually coming back and conducting terror on Russian soil. So that's very important for them.
And it doesn't matter how often they use the terminology moderate militias. They're nowhere near moderate if we're looking at what they've done and what they're doing right now. I'd like to hear your response, but I also want to hear the Turkish approach to this situation. To what degree is the Ankara government persistent about fulfilling its objectives for Syria, considering also the fact that vocally they've been very adamant at persisting with Operation Spring Shield, but at the same time, we see on the ground they were more reluctant from doing so. Also, keeping in mind the polls that were taking place in Turkey, with a little bit over 50% rejecting this operation as useless, and only 46% backing the Ankara government in this cross-border adventure.
Well, I just wanted to also relate to your comments. And from the Turkish point of view, I mean, as you already mentioned, that the Russians have to get rid of all these elements. And from the Turkish perspective, since they have intervened in the Syrian civil war, so they became their big brother of all of these entities. So if Turkey will not protect these entities, so these people, these elements may come to Turkey and they may carry out some terrorist attacks. So also for Turkish point of view, it's a very grave concern. It's a very, how should we say? It's a hot potato. They would like to hold it, but they cannot hold it. So they are trying to establish a boutique Syria inside of Syria for these people. And regarding your question, in the Turkish social media, we are witnessing that the Turkish government is not getting its support that it really desired. Many people are criticizing the government because of these high casualties. Many people are filming the Syrian refugees who are leaving Turkey for Europe, and they are saying, "Look, they don't want to live with us." You know, for 5 years, for 6 years, we fed these people, and now they are just going away. And even they are not, they are not assisting to our Turkish armed forces in their own soil. They would like to enjoy their lives, and instead, our soldiers are dying in Syria. So many of the Turks are very critical. And from my perspective, even if the fact that the Turkish government is very much insisting on achieving these goals in Syria, I sincerely, I'm very skeptical that it is sustainable. And it is also related with the Turkish economy. Nowadays, we are fighting also with coronavirus. And if this coronavirus will escalate, and if the Turkish airlines will be affected in a very grave manner from this crisis, it will also, from my perspective, will have side effects on Turkish foreign policy and its extraterritorial.
Indeed. Mr. Oren, I'd like to hear your analysis about this specific situation, and we'll also add to it the element of the migrants flooding into Europe. But I'd like for a short moment to touch on the coronavirus, as if we make a certain analogy to the Spanish flu, even though it's quite far apart about its characteristics, at least at this stage. The Spanish flu occurred during a very deadly period in Europe, First World War, different battles, a lot of the dead in World War I, taking the combined death toll, it superseded quite significantly the death toll from all other reasons of death. And here also, when we're talking about a situation of conflict zones, to what degree can they limit such an outbreak, which could devastate entire countries?
They cannot contain those towns, cities, districts where people are not only moving about but running for their lives, and those poor souls don't know what to fear more, the virus or the air attacks, and sometimes the chemical attacks, and they are between a rock and a hard place, sometimes between two shelling artillery groups. So one cannot simply order people to stay where they are. And yes, migrants and displaced persons could carry the virus into other districts, other countries, if they cross the border. The Spanish flu may not be a comparable precedent, simply because the public health system and medicine itself have been improved over the years, as did global cooperation and cross-fertilization between experts. But yes, if we see not only thousands of fatalities, but tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, and even millions, yes, it will be a major cause of devastation for mankind.
About the migrant issue, there's been some contention between Greece and Turkey. For that matter, as we're running out of time, I'd like to hear you, Ms. Lear. To what degree are the Greek authorities able to withstand such an influx, also considering the fact, and it's quite interesting, that those migrants are directed by Turkish police, which announced openly that it deployed about 1,000 special police forces in order to push the migrants from coming back into Turkey. So they're right now in a dead zone, fleeing from Greek riot police on the one hand and Turkish special police on the other. It's quite interesting, though, that on the border of Bulgaria, we don't see that many migrants or so-called refugees, as Chancellor Angela Merkel refers to them.
Well, Greece is obviously concerned about how it's going to contain the refugee stem. What I wanted to say was, in terms of what does it mean for Russia, it's all playing into Russia's hands, because from a Russian perspective, the more Europe is struggling, the more the European Union is put into a crisis situation, the more refugees flood Europe, can only benefit Russia's global view. So from the Russian perspective, this is actually Erdogan and Turkey playing their card.
Indeed, Dr. Cohen Yanarocak, the Russians are playing Turkey, also considering the fact that Turkish efforts to send those migrants into Europe further alienates Ankara from the West.
Yes, and at the same time, Turkey is expecting to receive NATO help. And let us not forget, the same members of the European Union are the members of NATO. So it's a very, it's a dilemma. And let us not forget, also the coronavirus is playing a crucial role here.
All of which we'll have to come back and revisit here at our Jerusalem Studio program. I'd like to thank you, Ms. Lear, Mr. Oren, and Dr. Cohen Yanarocak for being here with us. And I'd like to thank our viewers as well, and we will see you next time.
You just watched TV7 Jerusalem Studio. We encourage you to pray for the challenges raised in today's program. If you were blessed by our production, please consider supporting TV7 Israel. The details of our respective bank accounts for donations from Europe and the United States appear on the screen. Your generosity allows us to continue to serve God's calling, to broadcast content that truly matters through TV7 Israel from Jerusalem.